Forced cannibalism. Every third person in the world is afraid of experiencing a fatal plane crash. The people in this story were involved in such a crash and experienced true horror. Back in 1972, Uruguayan Flight 571 was on its way from Uruguay to Chile. The plane was filled with 45 people, including the cabin crew, a rugby team, as well as their families. For most of the way, everything seemed to be going fine. But then the pilots made a fatal mistake. Thinking that he was seeing the runway of a Chilean airport, the pilot began the landing procedures. He realized that what he mistook for a runway was actually a mountain. With no time left to save the plane, they crashed into the Andes Mountains. The pilots managed to avoid a direct crash, but still came into contact with the mountain. One part of the plane was lost completely. People were pulled outside to their death. Eventually, the plane comes to a stop, with the last impact killing the two pilots. However, due to their desperate attempts to save the plane, something unbelievable had happened. Miraculously, 33 passengers were still alive, meaning that only 12 had died during the whole ordeal. The survivors were now faced with a new, horrible situation. They found themselves on top of the Andes Mountains with a limited food supply, freezing temperature, and a less than perfect shelter. Those who were able to move built a makeshift shelter out of debris and luggage. On top of that, they gathered the plane's remaining food supply and began to write SOS on the plane with lipstick they had found. Despite these efforts, 5 people froze to death during the first night alone, and within 1 week, another person joined the list of casualties. At this point, it became clear that food and temperature would be their greatest enemies. Since they were planning to arrive in Chile, none of the passengers had packed warm clothes. And anyone who ever boarded a plane knows that their food supply is not only limited, but usually not filled with the most nutritious commodities. But at least they had their SOS sign and hoped that rescuers would find them once the plane was reported missing. At least one would think that. The cruel reality was that they had actually found a functioning radio and were able to listen to national news. While being stuck on the mountain, they witnessed the reports of their plane being missing and a huge search being launched. But the same radio that gave them hope at first, later delivered a crushing blow to them. After 1 week of listening to the news, they heard the report that all search efforts were called off and that they had been declared dead. Since the pilots crashed the plane about 70 miles from their destination, no one knew where they were. Hearing this group of officially dead men realized that they would be stuck on that mountain longer than they had anticipated, a fact that didn't really get along well with their shrinking food supply. When their food supply was done, they opted to eat the airplane seats. It wasn't the best food, but the leather and the cotton kept them alive for a time. One of these days, while eating the last pieces of these leather seats, the first few survivors realized what the next step would be, at least if they wanted to survive. They didn't have any food or leather left, but what they did have were dead bodies. The bodies of the fallen survivors had been preserved by the cold weather and were the only remaining food source. The survivors were faced with a terrible choice, becoming a cannibal to maybe survive this whole incident, or refuse to indulge in eating human flesh and starve to death. But with time passing and hunger growing, the majority of people accepted this new reality. The few people who were absolutely opposed to this idea would end up starving to death. There was one woman who never participated in these acts and finally starved to death on day 60. The other group started by eating the two pilots. No one knew them personally, and so they were deemed to be the best fit. But with more and more time passing by, the remaining survivors were slowly forced to eat their loved ones. At some point, an avalanche even killed 8 additional people, whose corpses were then used to replenish the food supply. During all of this, there were basically 2 groups with different views on what they should do. One group proposed to try and climb the mountains, while the other group preferred to stay in a group, arguing that they would most likely die either way, and if they were gonna die, then they should die together. On top of that, staying as one big group technically made it easier to spot the group. But 2 months after the crash, 2 of the remaining survivors had enough and made a fateful decision. They would not sit around and wait for their death. The 2 men packed some food and began to climb the mountain. Despite having not much food, no map, no compass, and a depleting supply of energy, these crazy guys actually did it. 9 freaking days they walked across the mountains and finally reached a valley. There they made contact with local fishermen. After some communicative struggles, they managed to make the locals understand that they had survived a nearby plane crash. All of the 14 survivors were saved by 3 helicopters and managed to recover, at least physically. One can only imagine what kind of mental scars an experience like that would inflict on a person. These 2 pictures are now famously associated with this horrible accident. One being a photo of the passengers shortly before they crashed, and the other when they got rescued after spending 60 days as cannibals. Together, these pictures paint a tragic story of how a group of normal people were forced to commit disgusting actions in order to survive. Lost in the wild. Chris McCandles was the oldest of 2 siblings and was living with his family in Virginia. With his dad working at NASA and the family being both rich and religious, they seemed perfect. Depending on who you believe, this perfect family was far from perfect. Chris's sister Karina later claimed that their father would become violent after getting drunk. Their half-siblings corroborated these stories. Meanwhile, both parents claimed that these stories of domestic violence are completely made up. I don't know them and will let you decide who you believe more. Either way, something led Chris to abandoning his everyday life and his family. From a young age, he was obsessed with the idea of exploring nature and going back to the roots of living. Moreover, the duality or hypocrisy of his family was another factor that pushed him away from human society. Like I already mentioned, his father would not only switch from violent to calm, but was also married to both his first wife and Chris's mother at the same time. At the same time, his father often tried to buy Chris's affection, which led him to hate material wealth. After graduating from university in 1990, he donated all his money and finally went on his adventures. Chris just drove off to the west without a specific plan. After having problems with his car, he even began to travel only by hitchhiking or by traditional hiking. Eventually, he turned up in Fairbanks, Alaska. On April 28, 1992, Chris met with a man named Jim Gallion and convinced him to drive him to the Stampede Trailhead, a particularly long and famous hiking trip through the Alaskan wilderness. Jim later stated that he didn't believe Chris would survive this trip due to his small food supply, wrong gear, and lack of experience. And he told these concerns to Chris. But Chris was determined and even denied Jim's offer to buy him better equipment. He only reluctantly took a pair of wet boots, 2 sandwiches, and a bag of chips from Jim. What follows is a reconstruction of what happened to Chris after entering the trail. This reconstruction was based on a day chart and various notes later found in the woods. After just 4 days, Chris discovered an old bus that was left in the wilderness. Back in the days, vehicles like this one were used for workers to live in. It was simply cheaper to drive the buses out into the wild instead of building real structures. However, this particular bus had been damaged and no one bothered to fix it, which is why it remained in nature. This vehicle would become Chris's main camp, and there are countless photos he took during his time there. During this time, he would mostly eat berries and some small game. He would hunt with a small rifle. After several weeks of being in the wilderness, he wanted to return to civilization. Chris often did that to restock on food and to get some rest, but this time he had made a crucial mistake. The nearby Teclanica River rises depending on the season and weather. When Chris began his journey, he could easily walk across the river, but when he returned on his way back, he was shocked. The river was now faster and too deep to cross, leaving him with no way to get out of the woods. Or at least that's what he thought. You see, this is where his lack of preparation became really apparent. If Chris had brought a map of the region, he would have known that only half a mile away from his position was a safe way to cross the river. There, the government had installed a hand-operated cable car for these exact cases. A diary entry he made on day 69 gives us some insights into his thoughts regarding this situation. Chris wrote, "River looked impossible, lonely, scared." Then on day 94, he wrote, "Extremely weak, fault of potato seed, much trouble just to stand up, starving." Based on these notes, it becomes clear that Chris was in trouble. He was stuck in the woods, was running out of energy, and he had become sick. Day 100, an achievement that would usually be a reason to celebrate, was marked by the following diary entry. "Made it, but in the worst condition of life. Death looms as a serious threat. Too weak to walk out. Have literally become trapped in the wild." Following this desperate journal entry, he left a note on the bus, which read, "Attention possible visitors, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. Is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I'm out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening." A tragic detail about this letter was the fact that it was the only time he used his real name during his travels. Maybe because he was painfully aware of his impending death and wanted to be identified easily. The final entry on day 107 only read, "Beautiful blueberries." The following 5 days had dashes through them, indicating that nothing special had happened. Day 113 was the fateful day when neither something happened nor were there any dashes going through it. In September, a group of hunters found the bus and the strange note. They could already smell something was rotting inside, and when they checked out the bus's interior, they found Chris's dead body lying in a sleeping bag. Forensic evidence later showed that Chris would have needed to survive 14 additional days in order to get rescued by the hunters. The hunters also found a picture of Chris, a picture he had taken on his final day, and the picture this section is all about. As you can see, Chris is waving at the camera and holding a note. The note states, "I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all." When this story and the now famous picture were published, this trial became a tourist attraction. They even renamed the journey the McCandless Pilgrimage. Due to the death of some of the tourists, the bus was eventually moved to the Fairbanks University, where it became a permanent display. Chris's father added a plaque to this bus with the following message: Chris, our beloved son and brother, died here during his adventurous travels in search of how he could best realize God's great gift of life. With his final message, we commend his soul to the world. The Fall. The Sapsford family was living in Sydney, Australia. Their 14-year-old son, Keith, had always been obsessed with the idea of traveling the world. He just wanted to experience something new and see everything the world had to offer. A good dream, but sadly one that wasn't compatible with the family's finances. Despite lacking the financial resources, his parents eventually saved enough money for one trip to Europe. The idea being that this trip would satisfy Keith, at least for a few years. After all, he could use all his money on trips once he was an adult. But this trip achieved the exact opposite. Now that Keith knew how exciting traveling could be, he felt robbed being stuck in his normal life. As a result, he became somewhat of a problem child. Keith made a habit of running away from home and trying to travel as far as possible. Most of the time, his parents were able to catch him before he did something stupid. At some point, they decided to enroll Keith in a strict boarding school, a classic trend back in the 1970s. Anyone who knows these boarding schools also knows that they are oftentimes more akin to prisons than actual schools. Without really realizing it, his parents had sent him to the worst possible place on Earth. Not being allowed to leave the premises and having to follow very strict rules was the direct opposite of Keith's desire for freedom and adventure. As a result, he made plans to flee from this facility. And 2 weeks after enrolling into this school, he did manage to escape. Keith then managed to hitchhike to the Sydney airport. You have to remember that this story takes place in the 1970s. Prior to the attack on the Twin Towers, airport security was basically a joke. This child easily managed to dodge every security measure and found a plane headed to Tokyo. But this is when he made a fatal mistake. Keith decided to stow away on the plane by hiding in the wheel well. There, he waited for the plane to finally take off and bring him out of the country. But as soon as the plane took off, the wheels were obviously retracted. With the wheel well opened, Keith just fell out of the plane and after a 200 feet or 60-meter fall, crashed into the ground. While this might seem like a stupid accident, his whole plan was doomed to fail anyway. If it wasn't for the fall, he would have 100% died due to a lack of oxygen or freezing temperatures. Anyway, the most interesting part about this whole story is that it was unintentionally captured on camera. John Gilpin, a professional photographer, happened to be at the scene in order to take pictures of various planes. Among these planes was also the one Keith had snuck on. Several days passed by before John began to look through all of his new photos. This is when he found this picture. Without realizing it, John had captured the exact moment Keith Sapsford had fallen off the plane, thereby capturing the last moments of the young boy before the fall would end his dream of traveling.